meaning rarely disappears all at once. It fails the way a stable structure fails, not by vanishing, but by shifting load into places it was never designed to carry. For a long time, explanations hold because they distribute pressure. They translate disorder into a sequence. They convert randomness into cause. They make events legible enough to live inside. Then something changes. Not the events themselves. The events can remain ordinary. What changes is the ratio between the weight of experience and the capacity of the explanation. When that ratio crosses a threshold, meaning does not soften, it does not stretch, it begins to fracture. The fracture is not dramatic. It appears first as a subtle discrepancy. The explanation still forms in the mind, but it no longer bears the feeling it is meant to hold. The words still arrange themselves, but they no longer stabilize what they name. The story still completes, but it does not settle the body. At first, this feels like fatigue. Then it becomes recognizably structural. A person continues to interpret, but interpretation starts to behave like a cosmetic surface. The surface remains intact, yet the support underneath no longer transfers weight. This is the moment old explanations fail. Not because they were false, because they were tuned to an earlier configuration of pressure. Meaning breaks when the inner system that produces meaning encounters a load it cannot distribute. It breaks when the function that once integrated experience into coherence becomes an instrument that merely repeats forms. Under normal conditions, meaning is not a philosophy. It is a stabilizer. It turns time into continuity. It turns pain into narrative. It turns desire into direction. It turns coincidence into pattern. It turns loss into an interpretable event rather than a raw rupture. It does this quietly, without being noticed, because when it works, it feels like reality itself. When it fails, the failure is misread as a problem of content. The mind looks for a better explanation. It searches for a stronger version of the old story. It tries to upgrade language. But content is not what collapses first. What collapses first is the hidden engineering that makes content persuasive. Old explanations fail when the inner system can no longer treat them as load-bearing. A person can describe what happened with perfect precision and still feel as if nothing has been described at all. That is not confusion. That is a structural mismatch. The mismatch produces a distinct kind of unease. It is not fear, because fear has an object. It is not sadness, because sadness still assumes a map of what has been lost. It is not anxiety in the ordinary sense, because anxiety usually attaches to future scenarios. This unease is closer to a displacement. The person remains the same, the world remains the same, but the layer that used to bind them together begins to separate. Under that separation, the mind continues to generate meaning, but meaning no longer behaves as an adhesive. It behaves as a thin covering over a widening gap. The gap is not emptiness, it is exposure. It is the exposure of experience before it becomes interpretable. For most of life, experience arrives already processed. It is met by a set of internal supports that immediately translate it into position, value, and implication. Even when something is difficult, it becomes difficult within a frame. When meaning fails, experience arrives without that frame. It arrives as pressure, without placement. The person begins to feel events as weight rather than as information. In response, the mind does what it has always done. It reaches for explanation. It assigns cause. It finds motive. It identifies a pattern. It constructs a narrative bridge. But the bridge no longer holds. A new kind of awareness appears. The awareness that explanation is not reality, and that the distance between the two can no longer be ignored. This awareness has nothing comforting in it. It does not produce liberation. It produces instability. Because the function of explanation was never merely to describe, it was to support. It held identity in place. Most identities are not built from traits. They are built from continuity. A person experiences themselves as a coherent unit because the mind creates a stable account of what is happening and why it is happening. When meaning breaks, identity begins to behave like a structure whose internal supports have shifted. The outer form remains recognizable, but the inner distribution of load changes. Certain parts begin to carry more than they should. This is why the failure of meaning often feels personal even when it is not. The person assumes something is wrong with them. They assume they are failing to understand. But the failure is not primarily intellectual. It is mechanical. Meaning exists to convert experience into a form that can be carried. When experience becomes too heavy, meaning fails in the same way any overloaded system fails, by forcing the strain into weak points. Those weak points are not always obvious. One weak point is the narrative of deserving. Many explanations depend on an implicit economy. Actions produce outcomes. Virtue produces reward. Mistakes produce consequence. Even when a person claims not to believe this, the inner system often still uses it to stabilize life. When meaning breaks, this economy loses credibility. Events no longer feel proportional. Outcomes no longer feel earned. Suffering no longer fits into a ledger. At first, the mind tries to repair the economy by intensifying it. It tries to locate the hidden error that explains the discrepancy. It searches memory for a moral flaw, a missed sign, a wrong decision. But the search fails because the economy itself has become non-functional. The system can no longer convince itself that proportionality exists. Another weak point is the narrative of progress. Many people live inside a silent assumption that time moves toward improvement, even if improvement is slow. This assumption is not optimism, it is structural. It tells the mind that strain has direction, that difficulty is movement, that pain can be integrated as a stage rather than as an end. When meaning breaks, progress becomes suspect. The mind can still say the word, but the word no longer anchors anything. Effort stops feeling like construction and starts feeling like maintenance in a building that keeps settling. Then the mind tries a different repair. It becomes more interpretive. It begins to overread. Because when the usual supports fail, the system compensates by increasing sensitivity. It attempts to regain stability by extracting meaning from smaller and smaller signals. Patterns proliferate. Associations tighten. Coincidence becomes message. The ordinary becomes charged. This can look like insight from the outside, but it is often compensation. A system, losing its ability to bear weight, will attempt to redistribute that weight across more points of contact. It will attach significance widely, because wide attachment feels like support. But wide attachment produces a new problem. When everything becomes meaningful, nothing becomes stable. The interpretive field becomes saturated. The person cannot rest inside any single explanation because each explanation immediately calls for another. The mind cycles through accounts, each one plausible, none one sufficient. This cycling is not indecision. It is the symptom of a deeper failure, the inability to settle. Settling is what meaning provides when it works. When it fails, the person can still understand, but understanding stops producing settlement. This is why meaning failure often arrives as insomnia of the mind, not because the mind has too many thoughts, but because none of the thoughts can carry the weight they are meant to carry. The person begins to sense that explanations are detachable. They can be adopted and discarded without changing the underlying condition. At this point, the problem is no longer that meaning is broken. The problem is that the person has begun to see the joints. They have begun to notice that meaning is constructed. That notice cannot be reversed. Once the system sees that its own supports are built, it can no longer treat them as given. This changes the entire experience of reality. What once felt self-evident becomes contingent. What once felt natural becomes assembled. What once felt inevitable becomes negotiable. That negotiation does not feel empowering. It feels destabilizing. Because the mind does not merely want options, it wants necessity. A stable inner structure requires certain things to feel non-negotiable, not because they are objectively true, but because the system needs fixed points to distribute pressure. When fixed points dissolve, everything becomes flexible. Flexibility becomes fatigue. The person begins to live in a field where every interpretation is optional, and therefore none can fully bind. This produces a new kind of loneliness. Not loneliness as absence of others, but loneliness as absence of shared ground. Shared ground is a form of meaning. It is the sense that events occur within a common framework, that experiences can be translated into a language that others can recognize, that reality has a baseline. When meaning breaks, the baseline becomes unstable. The person may still speak to others, but the speech feels like it floats. It connects socially, while failing to connect ontologically. They can describe the failure, but description itself starts to feel like a surface behavior. Because meaning failure is not a belief problem, it is a support problem. Belief can change. Support failure persists. At this stage, the mind often attempts the most aggressive repair it knows. It tries to force certainty. It searches for a single explanation strong enough to override contingency. It looks for a total account. It gravitates toward systems that do not permit looseness, because looseness has become synonymous with instability. This is not naivete. It is structural necessity trying to reassert itself. The person may become more rigid, not because they want rigidity, but because rigidity mimics support. It gives the sensation of fixed points. But forced certainty introduces its own fractures. It requires ignoring discrepancies. It requires suppressing nuance. It requires discarding parts of experience that do not fit. The system becomes internally divided. One part enforces the account, another part continues to register what the account cannot carry. That division creates strain. The person begins to feel a splitting between what can be said and what can be held. They may become fluent in explanation while internally drifting. Language becomes more precise, yet less connective. Concepts become more advanced, yet less stabilizing. The person becomes better at articulating the world while feeling increasingly unplaced within it. This is not because they are thinking incorrectly. It is because the function of thought has shifted. Thought is no longer integrating, it is bracing. Bracing is what a structure does when it anticipates failure. It is temporary reinforcement. It is not stability. This shift from integration to bracing changes the emotional texture of life. Even positive events can feel unconvincing. Joy still occurs, but it feels thin. Achievement still occurs, but it feels unbinding. Relief still occurs, but it feels temporary in a way that it did not before. The person begins to sense that nothing locks. The system cannot generate permanence. This is often mistaken for cynicism. But cynicism is an attitude. This condition is a physics. It is the experience of living without load-bearing meaning. At this point, the mind might try a different strategy. It might attempt to stop explaining. It might retreat into silence, not as peace, but as refusal. It might treat interpretation as the source of suffering and attempt to live without it. This can create momentary relief because it reduces the constant cycling of accounts. But it also reveals something difficult. Experience without interpretation is not neutral. It is intense. Interpretation was not only a story, it was insulation. Without it, sensations become sharper, time becomes heavier. The simple fact of existence gains weight. The person begins to feel exposed to the rawness of events in a way that cannot be metabolized. They may begin to experience their own mind as a space without internal partitions. Everything echoes. Nothing is buffered. This is not enlightenment. It is an absence of damping. A stable system requires damping. It requires mechanisms that absorb shock. Meaning provides shock absorption. When it fails, small impacts can feel like blows. Then the person tries to rebuild. Not by returning to old explanations, because old explanations no longer convince. Not by adopting new explanations, because new explanations are recognized as constructions. What remains is the attempt to live without structural certainty. This is where the condition becomes most visible. Because what breaks when meaning breaks is not only belief, it is orientation. Orientation is what tells the mind where it is in relation to what is happening. It is what allows an event to be placed within an interior map. This is a setback. This is a transition. This is a beginning. This is an ending. When orientation fails, events become unplaced. They occur, but they do not locate the person. This produces a peculiar sense of drifting while still being active. The person goes to work. They speak. They act. They complete tasks. They maintain relationships. But internally, actions become dislocated from narrative. They feel like movements inside a space that no longer has a stable geometry. This dislocation is often accompanied by a subtle loss of time. Not memory loss, but the loss of felt continuity. Days can pass and feel strangely unstitched. Weeks can accumulate and feel like they did not build. Life becomes a sequence of segments without a cohesive arc. This is not boredom. It is a failure of integration. Integration is the function meaning performed. Without it, time becomes a series of loads that never consolidate into a stable structure. The person might then discover something uncomfortable. They might realize that what they called meaning was never purely about truth. It was about tolerance. Meaning was how a human system tolerated being alive in a world that exceeds comprehension. It was how the mind made the world carryable. When meaning fails, what appears is the world as excessive. Not excessive as spectacular, but excessive as more than the system can hold. The person encounters reality as an overflow. This overflow is the residue of the condition. It does not resolve. The mind can learn to operate inside it, but it cannot eliminate it. Because the system that creates meaning is not infinitely extensible. It has a designed capacity. When the capacity is exceeded, the system either collapses into rigid certainty, or it disperses into endless interpretation, or it retreats into numbness, or it lives in exposure. None of these options restore the old stability, because old stability depended on not seeing the joints. Once the joints are seen, the system cannot unsee them. This is why the failure feels irreversible. It is not that the person can never find meaning again. It is that meaning can no longer be naive. Naive meaning is load-bearing because it is taken as given. Constructed meaning is lighter because it is known to be built. The difference is not philosophical, it is structural. A person may still form commitments. They may still value things. They may still interpret events. They may still tell stories. But the stories begin to behave differently. They begin to feel provisional. They can no longer function as foundation. The person lives in a space where the foundation has become visible as foundation. That visibility changes everything. It produces a perpetual sense of settlement without completion, a sense that the system is always adjusting, always redistributing weight, always bracing against an unnameable load. The mind becomes less certain that coherence is a property of reality and more certain that coherence is an internal achievement. That achievement requires energy. So the person begins to experience coherence as effortful. They can hold it for a while, then it slips. They can rebuild it, then it cracks. They can brace it, then strain transfers elsewhere. This is the condition, meaning as maintenance. Not meaning as discovery, not meaning as gift. Maintenance has no climax. It has only continuation. As life continues, the person may notice a final shift. The question of what things mean becomes less central than the fact that meaning is unstable. The mind no longer searches for the perfect explanation. It begins to register the underlying volatility of explanation itself. Events occur. Interpretations form. The interpretations fail to settle. New interpretations form. The cycle continues. The residue remains, the exposure of experience beyond interpretation. That exposure cannot be closed. It becomes part of the interior climate. What remains is not despair and not insight. What remains is the awareness that the inner system was built to carry a certain world, and that the world it now encounters exceeds that design. The person continues to live, but the old architecture of explanation no longer guarantees shelter. Meaning breaks. What persists is not the absence of meaning, but the absence of structural innocence. The explanations still exist. They simply no longer hold.